What is up, SkinClub community? ELFISHGUY back once again with another exclusive video for you guys. Now, as you'd know, over the last couple of days, the major invites have been confirmed. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to educate you guys on some of the teams that you might not be quite as familiar with. Obviously, those being the teams from Asia, my home region, and a region that I really love talking about. So today, we're going to start by talking about the Mongolian teams. I think later on in the month, we'll talk about the Chinese teams, and then maybe I'll do another one in the lead up to the major about FlyQuest prior to doing a general major preview kind of a video. So let's talk about the Huns first. They are perhaps, I think, the other side of the coin to the Mongols. When we talk about these Mongolian teams, you would be looking at the Huns and saying, well, I haven't really heard about much about these guys, barely seen them play. You might have maybe seen them play at the Blast Open Spring back earlier in the year, whereas the Mongols are obviously one of the best teams in the world. So I think it's probably pertinent to start with the Huns and spend a little bit more time talking about the Huns than the Mongols, because I think they're the team that most people are going to be a little bit more unfamiliar with. So we'll start with them. They are the number 39 ranked team as of recording on the VRS, which is relatively impressive considering that they don't actually get the opportunity to play at many international events. And I'd say just as a gut feeling kind of a level for me, I think they're probably sitting somewhere in the 5th to 8th region in Asia. Obviously behind the Mongols, Envision, Tyloo, and FlyQuest, and they're somewhere around a rare atom kind of a level. You obviously can have conversations around Chinggis Warriors. There's maybe another team or two that you can kind of throw in the mix there that would compete with the Huns. But I'd say based on the recent results that we've been seeing from them, they have been the number two Mongolian team, or I guess the number one Mongolian team, if the Mongols are now kind of considered a team that has like transcended the domestic tournament sort of structure. So they're sort of that second fiddle, I guess, behind the Mongols in terms of Mongolia. They've consistently beaten out the likes of their closest rivals in Chinggis Warriors, but I think they've also had some pretty good results in comparison to the likes of the other Mongolian notables, such as Eruption, IHC, and Nomads in a number of events. So if we would go back over the last few months, right, they've pretty much won everything actually in Mongolia and sort of to an extent the greater East Asia region. They won ESN Fall Showdown, they won the CAC qualifier, which was an East Asia qualifier, they won the Extreme Zone qualifier, and they won Mesa Pro Series, all of which are events that kind of featured the top Mongolian teams, but also in some cases other Asian teams as well. I think, to be fair, to be honest, saying that they are the number 2 team in Mongolia kind of goes hand in hand with saying they are the number 2 team in Asia outside of China. Obviously, China's kind of got its own ecosystem, but Mongolia alongside the rest of Asia, if you're the top of Mongolia, well, by default, you're kind of the top of the rest of Asia at that point, because there aren't really any Southeast Asian teams of note at this point. So to say they're the second top team in Mongolia behind the Mongols kind of, would indicate that they're doing pretty well against the rest of Asia as well. So I'd say it's safe to say that they're kind of comfortably on top domestically, but given that we're obviously talking about them heading to the major, probably a better idea to get a bit of an idea of what the international level is going to look like for these guys, which unfortunately isn't going to be quite as positive. We go back to the Blast Asia Rising event in Ulaanbaatar. They played against FlyQuest in the final there. They lost that one 2-0. And yes, you could say that final was played under like less than ideal circumstances. I believe it started around midnight, finished after midnight, after multiple hours of delays. Still obviously not a great result to be getting banged out 2-0 by FlyQuest. And I think that was one of the first events that FlyQuest played with JKS as well. Aside from that, they've struggled in a couple of ECL Asia Cups that they've played in. They did make it sort of deep in both of those. I think they've placed top 4 in both of them, but they lost to Tyloo and Rare Atom respectively in Cup 1 and 2, which again is not a hugely positive result given the level that those two teams, more specifically Rare Atom, are looking at internationally. Tyloo, they've been having their ups and downs, but they've had some decent moments. So I guess you can kind of let them off for dropping to Tyloo. I think that one's acceptable, but losing to Rare Atom definitely raises a few questions. And they did actually get some sort of small opportunity to play against some of the Tier 2 European competition at the Mesonomadic Masters as well, which was earlier in the year. They lost a reasonably close series to Bait, which was, I think, again, not a positive sign necessarily for them going into this major. That is a team that they are actually going to have to contend with at stage 1 here. So something for them to kind of consider and work on. But, they had a reasonably competitive series to go to 3 maps. And that's, I suppose, in some senses a tick in that they've made it close and that they've made it competitive. But in some senses across that they have lost to a bunch of teams already that, they're going to have to compete against at stage 1 of the major. And the only real competition that they've had in terms of tier 1 this year was back in March when they did play, like I said, at the Blast Open Spring. And that was, if you remember, where 9 had this really standout tournament. I think the team as a whole didn't go very well. They actually ended up going winless. But 9, at the very least, did kind of manage to put together some highlights. He had that Deagle 1v4 against Spirit on Dust 2, but generally speaking, his numbers were actually quite good. And as a team, they were able to push Falcons to an OT map. Obviously, pushing out Falcons to an OT map, particularly at that time, wasn't maybe necessarily the most exciting of results, but it does kind of indicate, again, let's talk BO1s with regard to the Major. Maybe there's a world where they could take a scalp or two. So I would say, I think with those results in mind, things don't necessarily look too favorable for Huns. But they have been slowly improving their roster throughout 2025, and that's where things are going to maybe start to get a little bit more interesting. You've obviously got the core of Bartak 9 and Cobra Zera, which still remain, and then there's Rolt as well. He's kind of like been in and out, but I think you could almost kind of consider him core as well. More importantly, I think the discussion now starts to focus in on the big firepower injection that they've had, which is Score. He came in about a few months ago. Obviously, Score's a name that many people will remember from the rise of the MongolZ, when he was back there, and they were known as IHC. He was obviously considered their star player. In fact, this is actually going to be his first major appearance since he played with that lineup, which was 3 years ago. So he's got a little bit of redeeming to do, I suppose. He's been kind of out of the game in that sense. He has been competing a little bit domestically within Mongolia. He was playing throughout 2024. He's kind of been playing throughout 2025 in various teams. He was in Eruption. Now he's obviously moved over into the Huns, and I think it's a good move for him, and I think it's a good move for the team. His numbers have been looking generally pretty good in this Huns lineup, and considering that he is replacing players like Wetzel or Yami, those were the two players that were kind of in this position prior to his addition, I think many would probably consider that this is probably the strongest lineup that the Huns have had in a reasonable while. Wetzel was definitely underwhelming. Yami, people quite excited about Yami, but I think he's had his own issues as well. So Score coming in, obviously quite an experienced player at this point now as well, I think is a good addition. Truthfully, I do like the roster. I think domestically speaking, they've definitely done what it has been required of them to be a top 2 team in Mongolia, and even with regard to the greater Asia competition, I think there's a lot that can be said about their level and what level that they could hit. I definitely think that they could, quite easily take a sort of 5th to 8th position in Asia, but maybe even start to push the likes of, again, like Rare Atom, maybe even FlyQuest, if FlyQuest are on a bit of a downward trend, to kind of like jostle for like a top 4 position in Asia, should, some of those invite slots get taken away in the coming years, depending on how the results of the Asia teams do at this major. I personally think they're a better representative as well than maybe what Chinggis Warriors would have been last year. Well, not last year, sorry, at the last major. So I'm kind of happy to see them there. I think I do have a positive vibe when it comes to this Huns roster, and have had for a very long time. I've always kind of like liked the composition of the roster, or at least the names on paper. It's just I don't think that they've really hit the level which you would expect from names like this. Like, I like the blend of experience that you get, right, with your likes of 9, Bartak, and Score being the sort of experience heads, and then the youth element being Zorolt and Cobra Zera, kind of like a couple of fresher players. Obviously, two very impressive individuals as well when they have their own sort of moments. I think they're 2 up and comers that definitely deserve a shot on a bit of a bigger stage from Mongolia. But again, like I said, like the results just aren't quite there yet, really. Even against some of the better teams in Asia. Again, Tyloo, Linvision, FlyQuest, I would say, are all beating the Huns pretty comfortably. And even then, you look at Rare Atom, and Rare Atom's also able to beat these guys. So I don't know that necessarily paints a picture that they're going to go too deep in stage 1, in especially what looks to be a relatively competitive field, right? When we're talking about the Huns not having success against those teams, but then you add Bait into the mix as well. You go Bait, FlyQuest, Rare Atom, and Linvision all in stage 1, and all of these teams are teams that the Huns has already kind of struggled with this year. That's a quarter of the field already that you might have some difficulty with, at least as a historical precedent. And I think many people would kind of look at Rare Atom and maybe FlyQuest as being 2 of the teams that are a little bit weaker in this stage in comparison to some of the bigger names. There's obviously certainly some bigger heavy hitters in stage 1. So my prediction would be that I do think the Huns can make some maps and series interesting and competitive, obviously with best of 1s in play. This is not a team that I think teams should be taking lightly. I'll probably avoid putting them as my 0 and 3 pick because, again, Asian CS teams don't go 0 and 3. But arguing that they're going to advance into stage 2 is probably going to be a tough task, in my opinion. So I do think that they're an interesting lineup. I like the team. I feel like they've finally kind of got a team together that could really compete. But to be fair, that's kind of what we've been saying about the Huns for the better part of 12 months, maybe even longer. Again, the score edition is probably the big jewel in the crown, I suppose, and we'll see how that works. But yeah, I think they're a decent team. I don't know that they're going to go much deeper than, maybe taking a map or two, but with BO1s in play, definitely consideration to maybe take an interesting series here or there, depending on who they end up facing against. Now, in saying that, obviously, Mongolia's hopes, as always, will rest on the shoulders of the MongolZ, which takes us to the much more known team. And I don't know that there's necessarily so much for me to say when it comes to the MongolZ in comparison to the Huns. I think most people are pretty well aware of what the MongolZ bring to the table. They're a bit more of a household name. But let's at least take a little bit of a look at what their chances realistically look like for this major. I think based on the way that this season has gone for them already, they are a bit of a conversation point. They were able to win EWC. They took a top 2 at Fisher, right? So they've had their ups, but they've definitely had their downs as well. They, I think, underperformed at Cologne. They didn't do so well at the most recent ESL Pro League either. So I feel they're a bit of a difficult team to read. Aside from those results, generally, it's been sort of like top 3, top 4, sort of 3rd, 4th placings, maybe your occasional 5th, 6th, 5th to 8th, depending on where they are. We look at PGL events, they're not, necessarily having as much success with those as they are with the ESL events. But generally speaking, I think a solid, consistent level from the MongolZ with a couple of really bright spots and a couple of sort of lowlights throughout this season. Again, as of recording, they are the number 1 team in the world, according to VRS and HLTV. But I don't know that that's necessarily a really compelling argument. I don't think that that's necessarily a true representation of the level that they're playing at the moment. And the ESL Pro League result is probably indicative of that. But to say that they're a title contender at this point does feel, I think, very fair, right? Senzu has kind of gotten over some of those choking issues that we were really, really talking about. And when this team is on, I would describe them as really on, if that makes sense. They can be a very average team when they're not playing super well. But when they are playing well, all the players are, again, on as a terminology. They're a team that can win S-tier events. We saw that at EWC. Now, is that replicable with someone like Techno, for example, having a lights-out performance at that tournament and not necessarily being able to replicate that on a consistent basis? Well, I guess we have to wait and see. But I do find that they have these spurts of brilliance every now and then, and they do have them, I would say, reasonably consistently at the moment as well. So I do think that there's definitely a possibility that they can go deep in this major. We hear of these like whispers of lack of practice at these tournaments that they're not performing well at. And, is that an excuse for something like an IEM Cologne? Probably not. Is it for maybe an ESL Pro League? Yeah, I think you could probably say it's not a massive concern necessarily for them to not be doing too well at ESL Pro League, but not doing so well at Cologne is definitely a factor. I think EWC really said or showed us that, winning an S-tier event is possible. But, again, the stage at EWC was, and I was there, I went to EWC, I saw the stage, I sat in the crowd. It was not a massive crowd. Like, it was not a massive stage. Certainly it's going to be far smaller than the one that they're going to play on at the major, assuming they do make it to the stage. So I would say, I think for me, for MongolZ, anything less than a semi-finals appearance is probably going to be a letdown, considering the run that they obviously had in Austin. It doesn't feel unrealistic to say that they could have a shot at the title. And I do feel like it's even possible for them to be a major winning side on their day and with a favorable bracket draw. But again, realistically, the position that they find themselves in right now, to me, feels like a bit more of like a solid semi-final qualification. And anything beyond that is going to be a bonus. So if they can make it into the semi-final, if they can make it to the top 4, I think everyone's going to be pretty happy with the result. No one's necessarily expecting them to be a back-to-back finalist, and certainly no one's expecting them to win. But again, it is possible if all things go right. And that's, I think, the big caveat for the MongolZ is that everything kind of has to be going right for them for it to be possible. Whereas some other teams you might look at and say, okay, their base level, let's say a Vitality, let's say a Spirit, is still probably going to be enough to get you very, very deep, if not into a final. Even if you're not having like an S-tier day, let's say. You've still got the individuals, you've still got the firepower, you've still got the fundamentals, you've still got the this, you got the donk factor, you got the whatever. MongolZ, I feel like it's like everything has to be going right, and then they can hit that level. Yes, the fact that they can hit that level is already impressive coming from Asia, where 12 months ago, 24 months ago, we wouldn't have even had a team that we would have considered realistically to make it, any deeper than maybe stage 3 if we're lucky, and that would have been MongolZ going like 3-2 in stage 2, for example. So different ballgame now, definitely for the MongolZ, but they're not quite there yet as far as I'm concerned as a team that will be world beaters, but I think they can do that. again, if the X factors all align, if the planets align. So that's my thoughts on the Mongolian teams. Obviously, you know, a little bit more to be said about the Mongols than there is about the Huns, but I think the Huns are going to be an interesting team to watch. I'm glad they made it to the major. I think they're a team that has been grinding away for a very long time, and I think they deserve it. It was quite painful to watch them miss out at the last major, the Austin major. They had a pretty early exit, unfortunately, from their respective qualifier, and that was pretty crushing to watch because 9 is, yeah, he's a bit of an OG, so he's been around for a long time. So it'd be cool to see them. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you want to have a conversation about the Huns. I'm more than happy to in the comments, and I'll catch you for the next video, which will be about the Chinese teams in a couple of weeks.